All right, let's dive into this week's stack of sources.
Yeah, there's quite a bit to unpack here.
Definitely. We're looking at the recent pretty dramatic back and forth about potential U.S. tariffs on EU imports.
It really has been a whirlwind. You had this threat of a massive 50% tariff.
Huge number. And a really quick deadline mentioned initially.
Right. And then almost as quickly, a sudden extension. So yeah, a lot happened fast.
So that's what we need to figure out. We've pulled reports from places like Fox Business, CNBC, NBC News, trying to get different perspectives.
Exactly. The aim here is to cut through some of the noise, pull out the most important bits from these sources for you.
And give you a clearer picture of what happened, the reasons given, the reactions.
And maybe where this fits into the bigger story of U.S.-EU relations, both trade and politics.
Okay, so the starting point has to be that initial threat, right?
Absolutely. President Trump announced he was recommending a straight 50% tariff on the European Union. Just bang, 50%.
50%. That's not a minor adjustment. And the sources said he wasn't just floating it, he actually set a date.
June 1st, 2025. That was the initial start date reported, so very imminent.
Wow. And did the sources mention his reasoning? Why such a drastic measure?
Yeah, he apparently laid it out in a social media post. The reports list several justifications he gave.
Like what?
Things like what he called the EU's powerful trade barriers, VAT taxes, that's value-added tax.
Right, the consumption tax.
Yeah. Also, ridiculous corporate penalties, non-monetary trade barriers, even monetary manipulations.
Quite a list. Anything else?
He also mentioned unfair and unjustified lawsuits against Americans' companies.
Yeah.
And he specifically pointed to the trade deficit.
Ah, the trade deficit. How much did he claim?
He claimed it was more than $250 billion a year with the U.S., called it totally unacceptable. So, a clear list of complaints and a big number attached.
Okay, so that was the situation. Big threat, tight deadline, specific grievances listed.
That's right. That was the picture heading into the weekend. But then, things changed quickly.
This is the extension part.
Exactly. The sources all report that President Trump agreed to an extension on that proposed 50% tariff deadline.
How did that come about? Was there a reason given?
Well, according to the reports, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, actually called President Trump.
She called him directly.
Apparently so, to specifically ask for the extension.
And he agreed.
He confirmed the call happened, yeah, and stated he agreed to push that deadline back. The new date mentioned is July 9, 2025.
July 9th. Okay, so a bit more breathing room.
Right. He reportedly described agreeing to it as his privilege to do so, and said that trade talks, would begin rapidly now.
And what was the EU side saying? Von der Leyen's reaction?
She described it as a good call. Her statement, according to the sources, said Europe is ready to advance talks swiftly and decisively.
So basically confirming they wanted the time to negotiate.
Pretty much. She said they needed the time until July 9th to work towards reaching a good deal.
So the immediate fire seems to have been put out, at least for now.
Temporarily, yes. And you saw that play out almost immediately in the financial markets.
Ah, right. The sources mentioned that. How did markets react?
Well, first to the threat, European stocks reportedly sank quite a bit on Friday, right after that 50% tariff news broke.
Understandable. That level of tariff would be disruptive.
Definitely. But then, with the news of the extension coming out over the weekend,
They bounced back.
yeah, European markets saw a rebound Monday morning, moved into positive territory. One source even called it a tentative risk-on rally. A sigh of relief, basically.
But this whole episode, the threat and then the quick pullback, the sources suggest it's not just a random event, right?
No, not at all. They really emphasize that this tariff threat is seen as the latest attack, fitting into a pattern.
A pattern of what?
A broader souring of relations, as one source put it, and months of distrust and economic sparring between the U.S. and the EU.
So we need to see this in that bigger context. It's not just about this one tariff proposal.
Exactly. It's presented in the sources as part of a more strained dynamic overall.
Which I guess leads us to look at the perspectives mentioned in the reports, especially from the U.S. side, about this relationship generally.
Right. And according to these sources, President Trump has been pretty consistent in his view. He's quoted saying the EU is very difficult to deal with.
And that negotiations weren't working?
Yeah, that trade talks were going nowhere. And sources also point out this isn't a new sentiment for him.
They mentioned his previous statements?
They referenced comments from back in 2018 and apparently reiterated more recently, where he stated his belief that the EU takes advantage of America.
And even that it was, what, formed in order to screw the United States? That's strong language reported there.
It is. And we also get some insight into the perceived strategy from others quoted in the sources,
Like who?
like the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He's quoted suggesting Trump is trying to light a fire under the EU.
Why? What was Bessent's reasoning, according to the report?
He apparently pointed to what he called a collective action problem in Brussels. The difficulty of getting all 27 member states on the same page quickly for negotiations.
Ah, okay. So the idea was to force a faster response.
That seems to be the interpretation presented. And we also see Stephen Moore, who's described as a former economic advisor to Trump.
What was his take?
He cited viewing that huge 50% number as a shot at the bow. Basically a way to express frustration that the EU hadn't, in his view, come to the table with a serious deal sooner.
So different figures around the administration offering interpretations of the tactic.
Right. And it's worth noting the sources also mentioned that these trade issues exist alongside other sort of broader criticisms or views about Europe expressed by some U.S. figures.
What kind of thing? Again, just reporting what the sources included.
Exactly. For instance, one source references Vice President J.D. Vance's criticisms regarding European values and their approach to aid. And another mentions Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's reported view that Europe relies on America for defense like a sucker. One source even cited reports about Elon Musk supporting a far-right German party that wants Germany to leave the EU. So these are all viewpoints presented in the source material, painting a picture of the current climate.
Okay, so that gives us some context on the U.S. side, as reported. How about Europe? How did they officially respond to this, well, high-pressure situation?
Their official line, voiced by the European Trade Commissioner, Maroš Šefčovič, was quite firm, but also kept the door open.
How so?
He emphasized that the trade relationship, EU-US trade is unmatched, needs to be guided by mutual respect, not threats.
So, pushing back on the threat itself.
Yes. And he stated the EU remains committed to getting a deal that works for both, but, importantly, he added a condition.
Which was?
He said, as the reports note, that Europe prefers to negotiate, but not at any cost.
Not at any cost. That sounds like they were prepared for talks to fail.
It signals that, yes. And the sources suggest this isn't just talk. They describe Europe as having been bracing itself for months for the possibility of a more distant economic relationship with the U.S.
Bracing how? What does that mean in practice?
Well, part of it seems to be preparing for retaliation, if needed. Šefčovič reportedly announced that the EU has identified over $100 billion worth of U.S. goods for potential retaliatory tariffs.
Wow, $100 billion. So they have their own list ready to go.
Apparently so. It shows they have leverage they're willing to consider using.
And is it just about trade? Or are there other signs of this bracing?
It seems broader. The sources also mention Europe preparing for a future where, perhaps, they can't rely quite as much on America's security guarantee, particularly regarding Russia.
How so?
They cite Germany's recent move to deploy a permanent military brigade outside its borders for the first time since World War II as one example of this kind of strategic adjustment.
Interesting. So preparations on both the economic and security fronts.
It appears that way, based on the reports. Both sides signaling they have options if negotiations don't work out.
Okay, so we have the positions, the threats, the counter preparations. What are the analysts saying? How do the experts quoted in these sources see this playing out?
Well, one very consistent theme is that this isn't over just because of the delay. The threat of tariffs escalating is still very much there.
So uncertainty remains high.
Definitely. Investors are being told to buckle up. One source put it bluntly, this ride's far from over. So expect more volatility.
Did any analysts offer specifics on what might happen by the July 9th deadline?
Holger Schmeiding, an economist at Berenberg, gave his view. He thinks the 6-week window might be just enough time to agree on a basic framework.
What kind of framework?
Perhaps leading to a lower blanket tariff, maybe something like 10%. He suggests that level might avoid major EU retaliation.
But what if it's higher?
Well, Schmeiding warns that if the U.S. pushed for, say, 20 or 30%, that would likely force the EU to hit back with significant countermeasures.
And what did he say about the negotiation style?
He characterized President Trump's approach as using shock tactics. But he also argued the EU is a huge market, an equals partner, and probably isn't going to be scared into just throwing in the towel.
Makes sense. Any other analysts weigh in?
Yeah. Guntram Wolf from Bruegel, he highlighted the massive uncertainty this whole situation creates.
Bad for business, presumably?
Exactly. He said it's bad for business, It's bad for consumers, and frankly, it's an unnecessary step.
Did he offer insight into the negotiation difficulties?
His analysis, as reported, is that the biggest obstacle right now is that it's just very unclear what exactly the U.S. president wants out of these talks. What's the specific end goal?
Lack of clarity being a problem. How did he think the EU is handling it?
He suggested the EU is playing it rather well so far, taking a sort of middle path, meaning not giving in too easily. He contrasted this with how the UK handled some tariff situations, but also not escalating aggressively like, say, China might. He noted the EU has the power to retaliate, but has chosen de-escalation up to this point.
Okay, a measured approach. Anyone else with a warning?
Nameslam from Zai Capital Markets definitely flagged July 9th as the next flashpoint.
What did he see happening?
He suggested the EU might offer things like phased tariff cuts and talks based on mutual respect. But he cautioned that what he called Trump's America First bravado could still lead to a slugfest.
A trade slugfest. What would be the impact of that?
Potentially significant disruption to supply chains, and it could fuel inflation. He specifically mentioned sectors like tech and industrials being braced for whiplash.
It's also interesting you mentioned the UK briefly. One source touched on their situation.
Yeah, and noted the UK seems to have avoided the worst of these specific threatened tariffs, apparently agreeing to a 10% levy instead.
But now they have a balancing act.
Exactly. Balancing that relationship with the U.S. while also trying to manage its post-Brexit relationship and alignment with the EU, a tricky spot.
So if we pull all these threads together, the U.S. tactics, the EU response, the analyst views, what's the takeaway here from the sources?
I mean, what seems clear is you have a high-pressure negotiation tactic from the U.S. met by a response from the EU that's trying to be calm, show preparedness, but keep the door open. The real insight isn't just what was said, but how these reported positions and actions reveal the underlying strategies heading towards that July deadline.
Right. Okay, so let's bring this back to you, our listener. Why should you care about all this back and forth on tariffs?
Well, look, this isn't just abstract political maneuvering. These potential tariffs could have real effects. If you own or work for a business that trades goods across the Atlantic, this uncertainty directly impacts you.
And even if you don't, higher costs for those importing businesses.
Oh.
Well, they often get passed on, right?
Exactly. That could mean higher prices for you, the consumer, on all sorts of things, from cars to food to electronics. It depends on what goods eventually get targeted, if any.
And beyond just the cost of goods, this whole situation really shines a light on the current state of these major international relationships.
Absolutely. These are incredibly important alliances. Tensions here can affect everything from global economic stability to security cooperation. It matters far beyond just the trade figures.
Yeah, it's a complex web, and these trade disputes can pull on threads that affect a lot of other areas.
For sure. Real potential consequences on both sides of the Atlantic.
Okay, so let's try and sum this up. The immediate crisis over the 50% tariff threat is paused thanks to the extension. That gives negotiators until July 9th.
Right, a crucial window. But the sources make it clear. The underlying tension, the uncertainty, the potential for this to flare up again, that's all still very much present.
And both sides, the U.S. and the EU, seem to be signaling, based on these reports, that they're prepared to take a tougher line if these talks don't go their way.
Preparedness for negotiation, but also preparedness for confrontation, it seems.
Which really leaves us with a big question hanging in the air, drawing from everything we've just discussed from the sources. Considering the positions we've heard reported, the analysis of the negotiation styles, and this clear readiness for retaliation on both sides, what does that July 9th deadline actually represent? Is it a real chance for a deal that maybe resets things on a mutually agreeable path?
Or is it just a pause?
Yeah.
A temporary ceasefire before we see a much bigger, maybe more disruptive shift in how the U.S. and the EU relate to each other economically and maybe even politically? What really stands out to you from this deep dive?